Alrighty. Yeah, so we're getting into some of this stuff. I was the one also that stuck in that video of the animals with the mirrors up there. I wanted to give you a chance to feel what it's like to be, sort of a naive researcher, somebody watching things for the first time, in that case, watching animals interact with mirrors, and then sort of forming some thoughts in your mind about what it is you're seeing and what's going on. That's often what naturalistic observation is about. So I want to talk about that a little bit more and some of the quirks. But mostly, one of the things I'm going to do along the way is give you stories that I think will make what you're learning, sink in a little more, and yeah, maybe even be a little more interesting. And when it comes to naturalistic observation, the story in my mind is with respect to the work that was done by Jane Goodall. So we're going to get to Goodall, but let me go back to this question. What's the question? Because I want you to have the purpose. I want you to have the sense of the purpose of naturalistic observation. We often use naturalistic observation to form theories and hypotheses. This is going to be more the philosophy side, that rationalist side of things. Although we're not just thinking about what we're not just thinking. A real rationalist like Rene Descartes, you imagine him sitting in a chair and just thinking. No, we're going to observe. We're going to watch the world around us. But as we watch, we are going to try with thought to understand what we're seeing. And that will invariably lead us to more specific research questions. So often, the purpose of naturalistic observation is to kind of fuel the whole research process by giving it questions to study. And this is the first challenge to any research project. If you join a lab and you're going to do some research, the first thing you're going to have to figure out is, well, what question am I trying to answer with my research? So let's talk about Jane Goodall's work a little bit, and put it in this context. The way the textbook talks about it, Jane's work would be more what they call participant research, although cross-species participant research. So let me tell you the story of Jane Goodall, first of all, because it's truly an amazing story. Jane had very little scientific training. She happened to know the Leakeys, who were very important in anthropological research. She had connections to them. She got to know one of them. And for whatever reason, he said to her at some point, Jane, there's fascinating animals in Africa called chimpanzees. They're the most like us of any animal in the animal kingdom, and yet we know almost nothing about them. Well, how about you go study them? So he's basically talking to, I believe she was an 18-year-old woman at that time from England, and with very little scientific training. And the suggestion was that she pick up everything and go live in the jungles of Africa with a bunch of wild animals that we don't know much about, chimpanzees. So it's quite a crazy thing to ask a young woman to do. Jane did it. I always imagine Jane going and telling her mother, "Hey, Mom, I'm going to this strange land called Africa." This is 1960s. So from a UK perspective, it was still a pretty exotic place. And I'm going to go live in the jungle with a bunch of animals to study them. Can you imagine how your mom would react if you said that while you were 18? What Jane's mother said was, "I'm going with you." Which is maybe not surprising. So Jane went, her mother went with her, they set up a little camp. And well, then what do? You're in this situation. There are chimpanzees around. And one of the first things Jane found out about those chimpanzees is they were kind of afraid of her in the encampment. They didn't come around very much. So her first challenge was getting to see them at all. But over time, as she was there, she developed her own set of methods, really amazingly. And one of the first things that she realized she had to do was become chimpanzee-like. If she wanted to gain their trust, She couldn't flaunt how she's different than them. In fact, she had to try to blend in. So even things like smells, she noticed that they would roll in certain things, and these could be feces and various other stuff that they found in the jungle. And so Jane would do the same thing. She would try to adopt their smell. They were often very low, as you kind of see in this picture, and Jane would spend most of her time sitting down or crouched down, or walking in the sort of hunched way that they walk. She brought herself low. And let me mention one of so we kind of get into, why would you do all this? Well, the notion was, if you can get them to trust you, or at least not fear you, then they may allow you to be around them. And if they're comfortable enough, they may start behaving like they naturally do. We're going to come back to this point in just a moment. But then you're the sort of fly on the wall, right? Then you can kind of watch their natural behaviors and see if there's anything that's interesting. So, for example, one of the things everybody felt about chimpanzees was that they were supposed to be the peaceful version of human beings. Everybody thought they were extremely, extremely peaceful, but they're not. One of the things Jane realized is that they at times could get very violent, and in fact they got violent with her on a number of occasions. They beat her up pretty bad a couple of times, and she learned, by the way, that they were going to do this every now and then, and that was part of studying them, is that if she crossed one the wrong way or caught them in the wrong mood, it might take out some frustration on her. And they're very strong, chimpanzees. You think of the little chimpanzees, the little cute ones, as you see in this one. This is more of an adult chimpanzee, and notice it's bigger than Jane. If you look at the bulk of its body, and especially if you look at the width of its forearms, strong arms. They are very strong beings. So obviously, not getting beat up became a priority for Jane, and she was kind of paying attention to, well, what starts these fights, and how do they go about, and how can I avoid being in them? And what she noticed was something very kind of interesting. Certain chimpanzees, when they met others, sometimes they would stare them in the eye, and typically one member of each pair would stare the other one in the eye, and the other member would put their eyes down. They would essentially submit to the person. It was like a ritual. So instead of shaking hands, there was this ritual where one chimpanzee would put its eyes down and the other one would kind of stare right at it. And what she quickly realized is that there was a structure to this. There was what we now call a dominance hierarchy, that certain chimpanzees, the leaders, they would stare at everybody, and everybody would put their heads down when the leader stared at you. But if you were sort of third in command, let's say, now you would submit to the leader or the second command, but you would stare at ones that were below you in the hierarchy. So simply by kind of paying attention to who submitted to who when, she got a sense of the pecking order, where people stood in this social hierarchy, where the monkeys stood. And she also learned that a lot of these battles begin when somebody who's supposed to be submissive, or at least that is their current place in the hierarchy, choose not to submit. So I'm sort of third, or I'm somewhere in the pack. Somebody above me looks at me. I'm supposed to look down, but I don't. I look up. That is now a challenge. I am now saying I don't want to be below you in the hierarchy anymore. And that would often be followed by a fight. And the winner of the fight would now get that new level of the hierarchy. So she was kind of watching this play out. Now, from her perspective, one of the notions was she learned to keep her eyes down. She learned to submit to everybody. And if you submit to everybody, you're a threat to nobody. And that got her a lot more ability to be around them and to see them. And so, this is just an example of, the notion that we knew nothing about chimpanzees until Jane was there, sitting and watching quietly and noticing things like what I just told you. And that started to give us some information about how chimpanzees operate. Now, if you really want to test that notion of dominance, though, it's kind of tricky when you're just observing, because then you just get what you get. Eventually, we can imagine an experiment where we test this much more directly, and sort of manipulate things to set up certain conditions. We're going to get there, but what I want you to see at this point is just this notion that just watching can give you ideas like, oh, maybe there's a social dominance hierarchy. This is a thought, this is a theory that came to her. And now she's seeing stuff that seem to fit with that theory. And so it seems to support it. As you're going to see, we're not really sure, because what we're really seeing there is what we're going to call a correlation. But this is where we start to form the questions and where we start to see things. Just another interesting story about Jane, because this animal theme will go all the way through the course. It's part of who I am. But the interesting thing about Jane is, because she had no scientific training, she just did things her own way. And as suggested here, instead of numbering the chimpanzees she observed, she gave them names such as Fifi and David Greybeard. And she really talked about their personalities and how they were different from one another. When she tried to publish this work, the editors of journals said, "You can't do that. You can't give a name to a chimpanzee. You're making them all seem like they're little human beings, but they're in fact animals. And because they're animals, you must just give them, chimp 1, chimp 2 kinds of cold, descriptive. You need to be the scientist. You need to be very cold. You need to be very descriptive, etc." And so she was running into that sort of Rene Descartes, animals are just machines sort of mentality, but it isn't one that she sort of embraced. And so there's this funny, from my perspective, interaction between people who saw these animals as living creatures deserving of respect, and those who saw them more as test subjects. That runs all the way through. A couple of other things, by the way, she did notice that they had a lot of gestures that we think of as human: hugging, kissing, patting on the back, tickling. And she thought that these created close, supportive, affectionate bonds that hold family members and communities together, even over spans of more than 50 years. So there was a lot of interesting stuff that came from her work, but she never ran an experiment. She watched and documented and told what she saw. That's observational research. It's participant research because she was sort of trying to make herself one of them as she did so. Okay, so one important point about this sort of research, and it's mentioned quickly in the textbook, but let me mention it again, is something called the Hawthorne Effect. Imagine, and I'll explain to you why a factory worker here, but let me give you a previous version. At UTSC at one point in time, none of us are physically there anymore, but there's a Tim Hortons there. I promise you, you've probably been there, maybe. And by the Tim Hortons, there used to be this wall of mirrors on one side, and the students used to say, "I think there's a bunch of psychologists on the other side of those mirrors. I think they're watching us as we get coffee and do stuff," and they're basically being Jane Goodall on the other side of that mirror. We're going to talk about research ethics, and you'll find out we can't do that. You're not allowed to sneakily watch somebody. That's unethical. But there are times when, psychologists want to kind of observe people and see how conditions affect what they do. So one example is the Hawthorne Effect. And this is an example from what we call industrial organization or industrial psychology. Some psychologists look at questions like the following. If you have a factory like this where people are just doing the same work over and over a day, what you care about as the owner of the factory is, how many garments, in this case, these workers can produce. So you want to increase productivity. So you might say, well, how could I change my factory to do that? Maybe should I play a little bit of music in the background? Should I have brighter lights or dimmer lights? What about windows? Do windows make a difference? How about airflow? And so we can imagine all these things that might affect worker productivity. And in one of the early studies, what they found was, if they brought in researchers and they said, hey, these researchers are going to change some things and see what affects your productivity, it didn't matter what they changed, or, did they add music or subtract music? Did they brighten the lights or dim the lights? It didn't matter. If they changed anything, productivity increased. Why? Well, because these people knew they were being watched and they knew they were being measured. And when you know you're being watched and when you know you're being measured, you don't behave in natural ways. And this is why Jane Goodall worked so hard to sort of chimpify herself, right? Because the more she was an external person, the less likely the chimps were to behave naturally. This is a problem with naturalistic observation. Once you insert yourself into a situation, the fact that you are there can change the behavior of, the behavior that you're investigating. And so just as a taste of that, imagine we're doing this little online thing, but somewhere in our Zoom, we have a little Zoom chat, and this dude shows up in our Zoom chat, and he's hanging around. He's like, "Oh, don't worry, I'm from another planet. I'm just watching to see what you humans do in your office hours. I'm curious about this." Are we just going to be like, "Okay, cool, watch away, have fun"? Or are we going to be a little freaky? Are we going to be like, careful about what we say, whatever, because this alien scientist is watching us? That's the Hawthorne effect, and that's what makes naturalistic observation so tricky. Especially on humans, like I told you with the UTSC thing, you cannot sneakily watch them. We did that with the animals in the mirrors, right? We just put up a video camera and kind of watched. We didn't get their consent. But with humans, as you'll find out, we have to get their consent before we can collect their data. So we can't hide and watch them. And if we don't hide, we might change their behavior. And so this just makes things a little trickier. And anytime we come to some question through naturalistic observation, we have to be worried that the actual act of observing might have changed the behavior. And so right at the beginning of our research project, we may have a problem. And we want to, like Jane, we want to do everything we can to minimize that from happening. All right, cool. See you in the next one.